Story of the Magic Table, the Golden Donkey, and the Club. This is one of the Grimm brothers' stranger stories, but I like it because it is quite fun. There was once a tailor who had 3 sons, and the goat was hugely important to them, because they were very dependent on the goat's milk. So there came a day when the tailor sent his oldest son out to graze the goat all day, and the son faithfully stayed with the goat while she ate and ate and ate. And as the sun was starting to set, the son said, "You had enough to eat?" And the goat said, "I have had enough. I'm completely stuffed." So the man took the goat home to his father, the tailor. And the tailor asked the goat, "Have you had enough to eat?" And the goat looked at the tailor and said, "How could I eat enough? The ground was dry and terribly rough, and the grass was dry and terribly tough." And the tailor looked at his son and picked up his yardstick, and the son, who knew what was coming next, simply ran out of the house. Second day, the second son took the goat to graze, and she grazed all day. And at the end of the day, the son said to the goat, "Have you eaten enough?" And the goat said, "I've eaten enough. I'm completely stuffed." And when the young man took the goat home to his father, the tailor said to the goat, "Have you had enough to eat?" And the goat looked at the tailor and said, "How could I eat enough? The ground was bare and terribly tough, and all the grass was dry and rough." And so the tailor looked at his son, and parents have a good supply of witheringly scornful looks, and the son simply ran out of the house and went off to seek his fortune. And the third day, the youngest son took the goat out, and of course she told him that she'd eaten enough. She was completely stuffed. And when the goat got home, she told the tailor, "How could I have eaten enough? The ground was dry and terribly rough, and all the grass was dry and tough." And so the tailor drove his youngest son away, and that left just him and the goat. So on the 4th day, it was down to the tailor himself to take the goat out. And as the sun was starting to set, the tailor said to the goat, "Have you eaten enough?" And she said, "Oh, I've eaten enough. I'm completely stuffed." But when they got home, the goat looked at the tailor and said, "How could I have eaten enough? The ground was dry and terribly rough, and all the grass was dry and tough." And the tailor realized that he had driven his sons away without cause, but there was nothing he could do. But he shaved the goat's head, and she was so ashamed of the way that she looked that she too ran away. And that left the tailor alone at home with his sewing. And so it carried on for some time. For the oldest son became apprenticed to a carpenter, and he worked very hard. And at the end of his apprenticeship, the carpenter said to the young man, "Because you've been such an outstanding worker, I will give you as a parting gift this table." And it wasn't really much to look at. Yet the carpenter showed the young man how it worked. Say to the table be covered, and a crisp white cloth will appear on the table, and plates and cutlery and fine food. You will never be hungry again. So the young man put the table on his back and began the long journey back to his father, thinking it would be good to see his father again. So the young man sometimes stayed in inns, and sometimes slept in the woods, and sometimes slept in fields. And he was almost home when he stayed at an inn where the innkeeper was a little dishonest. And the young man arrived there late, and the kitchen had run out of food. So the young man put his table down and said, "Table be covered." And to everyone's amazement, the table was covered with dishes of food which were far better than the ones that the innkeeper was serving. So the innkeeper was watching all this, thought, that's just the thing I need for my business. So the next morning, when the young carpenter left the inn with a table, it wasn't his magical table. It was one that the innkeeper had pulled out of his storeroom. So the young carpenter arrived home at his father, the tailor's, and showed him the magical table. But when they invited all their family round and tried to show them the amazing properties of the magical table, of course, nothing happened. So we can only hope that the relatives didn't laugh too much at the poor young man. So he quickly found himself a new master and a new place to work, and the tailor carried on with his sewing. It wasn't long after this that the second son, who had been apprenticed to a miller, ended his apprenticeship, and the miller gave him a donkey. The miller said, "This is no ordinary donkey, you know. This donkey can spit gold. All you have to do is say to it, 'Bricklebrit,' and gold will appear out of its mouth." And the young man wasn't really sure whether to believe him at first, but he soon found that all he had to say to the donkey was, "Bricklebrit," and gold coins would appear from his mouth. So the young man travelled home, and after some time he found himself at the same inn that his older brother had stayed at. And the innkeeper offered to take the donkey to the stable, but the young miller insisted on taking the donkey himself. And the innkeeper was a little surprised when the young man paid him with gold coins. And then when the young man went back to the stable to find more gold, he closed the door. But the innkeeper spied through a knothole in the wood, and he heard the young man say, "Bricklebrit," and he saw gold coins appear from the donkey's mouth, and the innkeeper thought, that's just the thing I need. So the next day, when the young miller left, he left not with the golden donkey, but with an ordinary donkey that the innkeeper had put in its place. So when the young miller arrived at home with his father, the tailor, and told him the story as to the magical properties of the golden donkey, and when the tailor invited all the family round, well, let's just hope that they weren't too disappointed, or that they didn't get their gold, and let's hope they didn't laugh too much at the poor young miller. But he found work quite quickly, and life carried on. But the two older brothers wrote to their younger brother and told them what had happened, and told them about the dishonest innkeeper. So, after some time, the third and youngest son, who had been apprenticed to a wood turner, ended his apprenticeship, and the master turner gave him a knapsack, and in it was a club. And the master turner said, whenever you find yourself in need and you feel yourself threatened, say to the club, "Club, club, get out of the sack." And the club will begin to dance on the backs of the people who are threatening you. And it will carry on until you say, "Club, club, get back in the sack." So, of course, after some time, the young man arrived at the inn where the innkeeper had stolen the magical table and the golden donkey. But he had been forewarned by his brothers. So, when he came to leave, he asked the innkeeper for his oldest brother's table and his middle brother's donkey. And when the innkeeper refused, he said to the sack, "Club, club, get out of the sack." And the club began to attack the dishonest innkeeper and danced so hard on his back that the innkeeper said, "I will give you the table, I will give you the donkey, just make the club stop beating me." So the young man said, "Club, club, get back in the sack." And when he arrived home at his father the tailor's and was reunited with his brothers, he had the magical table and the golden donkey. And so they invited all their friends and relatives to a great party where there was lots of food and lots of drink, and everyone went home with a pocket full of gold. And you really wish you'd been there, don't you? So the tailor was able to give up his sewing and was reunited with his sons and lived out the rest of his days in peace and luxury. So the only question left is, what happened to the goat? Well, the goat was driven away by the tailor, and she ran and ran and ran until she found somewhere safe. She found a foxhole, and she climbed into the foxhole. And when the red fox went home and saw two great eyes staring at him, he ran out of his hole, and he said to Bear, There's a beast in my foxhole. I don't know what to do." And the bear said, I'm not very good at dealing with beasts either. But the bee happened to be flying past, and she heard them. And the bee said, "I can deal with this, even though you fox and you bear, you're not always very nice to me." So the bee flew into the foxhole and stung the goat right on the bald patch on her head. And it hurt so much that the goat ran out of the foxhole and just carried on running. And she was never seen again. But if ever I find out where I can get one of those magical tables, I promise I'll invite you all to my house. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed that silly story, and I hope to see you all again soon. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. Bye for now.